Hello, hi, good day, good morning. Welcome back to Modern Church History. And this will be our final week number 10. And we've been covering the major characters in modern church history, the evangelical faith. So these are some of the figures that we have covered so far. Let's go back and see. Some major characters. Zinzendorf, a German, who founded, who was a bishop of Moravian Church. And Moravians became one of the major trend in North American church history as well. And he pioneered of 18th century Protestantism. John Wesley and Charles Wesley, so Wesleyan brothers, and George Whitefield, they become the founder of the movement, evangelical movement called Methodism. And Methodist still is a very global denomination, which began as a movement. And Jonathan Edwards, a very philosophical American revivalist and preacher. And he is one of the thinkers. So the thinkers they are basically scholars, but thinkers are leading people by promoting certain philosophy ideas. Not only they are promoting certain ideas, but they have to come up with those deep thought ideas. So you are to, become a thinking Christian. One of the major characters that make an evangelical as an evangelical is the thinking part. So you become a thinking Christian, and if you're an evangelical, if you want to call yourself an evangelical, you have to become a thinking Christian. Of course, we are believing Christians, and the many thought in the past, believing and thinking, the intellect and the faith does not go alone together. But Jonathan Edwards and some other evangelical leaders, they proved it to be otherwise. You can think, and at the same time you can believe. And your thoughts and your faith will not contradict one another. We covered D.L. Moody, one of the leading characters in North American Christianity. Now we come to the Benjamin Warfield. He's a professor of theology in Princeton Seminary. Now the Princeton becomes more of a liberal seminary, one of the leading liberal seminary, Princeton, Harvard. But at the time, in the 19th century to the beginning of early 20th century, the Princeton was the heart of evangelical faith. In 1881, Warfield wrote a joint article with A.A. Hodge on the inspiration of the Bible. It drew attention because of its scholarly and forceful defense of the inerrancy of the Bible. The reason the Warfield is a key person in discussion of evangelicalism because of this inerrancy of the Bible. Not only you just say Bible is without fault, Bible is whole truth and total truth. This person, the Warfield, he tried to, the professor, the Dr. Warfield, he tried to prove and elaborate in very rational and logical manner why the Bible is considered to be without fault. So that's one of the key literature in understanding evangelical faith or evangelicalism. So the inspiration of the Bible. How is the Bible being inspired? And Charles Hodge, is a chief defender of historical Calvinism in America during the 19th century. He argued strongly for the authority of the Bible as the Word of God, joined with this guy. So A.A. Hodges and Warfield. And then Charles Hodges is another Hodges. Okay. So the key idea of the evangelicalism again is the authority of the Bible as the Word of God. Now comes the Francis Schaeffer. He's a European, a Christian apologist and intellectual leader of evangelical pro-life and political movement. He's an American evangelical theologian, and not European. But as an American, he worked and based in the Switzerland, and built a so-called library community. It's still famous library community in Switzerland. See, one of the descriptions, as we see, he's an intellectual leader. Again, some of these intellectual leaders, including Franz Schaeffer, John Stott, and who else? John White. Some of these figures are very highly intellectual, educated. So again, I say, the evangelicalism and intellectualism goes in hands. And these intellectual leaders of Christian faith, the Protestant faith, they are the ones who has impacted modern evangelicalism, thus impacting modern church history. So as we try to understand modern church history, this intellectualism in Christianity and within the evangelicalism becomes one of the key matters or key contributions to modern church history. Another intellectual figure is Richard Niebuhr, a Christian theological ethicist. He majors in ethics and primary source of post-liberal theology. So there's a liberal theology, and it becomes a very political theology combined with a radical ideology. I have discussed this before in the class. So when the liberal theology is combined or joined or integrated with a radical political ideology, it becomes so-called liberating theology, no longer liberal. Liberating theology is the liberation of human being from the oppression and political oppression and social injustice is salvation. So that the understanding of salvation becomes very different from how we define in the Bible. Of course, the Bible includes that part of change within the salvation through Jesus Christ. But when you eliminate the salvation through Jesus Christ or the spiritual salvation, the eternal salvation part, and if you just focus on the earthly salvation, then it becomes liberation theology. And the liberation theology kind of dies down. And actually the other kind of ideology takes place, especially named sociology. So those, the countries and the areas where there were so-called liberation theology, no longer the liberation theology becomes the major trend. It dies down, dies out, and is being replaced by the socialism. And so there's a gospel, liberal social gospel, and then radical political ideology plus becomes a liberation theology, and then now it's just for the few radical Christians or radical socialist who is trying to use or reach some Christian Catholic population, they use a liberation theology. So it's not popular anymore. So that's where we are, post-liberal theology. And then Richard Niebuhr kind of leads and that fills that empty space where the liberal theology is left. And he is considered one of the most important Christian theological ethics in 20th century America. One of the major work he has written is titled Christ and Culture, which shines a very key, important light in understanding of evangelical Christianity. When consider America, 90% plus of American population was Christians, whether they're Methodist or Quakers or Amish, whatever the faith is. Either they are fundamental or conservative Christians. When the whole society is mainly Christians, the world is Christian and Christian is world. And there's no theological need to look at the secular community or secular society as a major consideration, because that's only minimal compared to the whole society, which is basically Christian. The nation is basically Christian. The culture is basically Christian. But now, at the time when he wrote this Christ and Culture in 1950, about this time, it's probably the 60% or probably 50-50. The evangelical Christians and the non-Christians. About 50-50, 60-40. So when that happens, the secular world is big. You have to notice that there is a different scene, and then you are going to need to see the culture, and culture becomes a big topic to discuss and to be concerned when you are doing a theology. It used to be the overseas, the Korea, Japan, China, South America, Africa, where you need to go and share the gospel because they are not evangelized. But when the half of America is not evangelized, then you have a new issue. So that's what had happened. And Richard Niebuhr, he began to see this dimension of very distinctive and strange and anti-Christian, sometimes even though it's not anti-Christian, secular culture that's existing. And the problem for us today is in 21st century. Probably the evangelical Christians in America is less than 40%, probably 30%, around the 30% range. And for us in Korea, the number of evangelical Christians are decreasing drastically. So this issue of secular world versus church versus evangelical Christian or versus Protestant, whatever you want to say, it becomes major concerns. So it's very different status of survival, existence. So as the reality around you, context around you changes, your survival is different. You need to take different strategies and different attitude toward your surroundings. So that's what Richard Niebuhr began to discuss. Jerry Falwell, one of the major American characters, is one of those founder of moral majority movement, an early leader of religious right. That right is right and left. Okay, so the religious left means usually it's radical liberal. Religious right means conservative, fundamentalist. Actually, Jerry Falwell is more of fundamental Christian. Listen, this religious right runs all the way through the Trump. Even though I don't think Trump is a genuine believer. I had never had a personal conversation with him, so I cannot make a good judge of it. But just reviewing what we see on the media, it's hard to consider him as a Bible-believing Christian, though he uses a Bible sometimes for his good. Anyway, so religious right or the moral majority, these are mainly the white Christians who try to maintain the traditional American Christian culture and the status and the power and so on. So it's both Christian and political movement. So Jerry Falwell is one who kind of integrates his faith in the politics and became a major leading figure. He's an American Southern Baptist pastor and televangelist and conservative activist, and he's a founder of Liberty University, which is one of the major Christian institution in America still today. So Jerry Falwell. Martin Luther King Jr. He's not exactly the evangelical as we define the term evangelical, but the reason that we need to introduce him is he's one of the American Baptist minister, but always say he's an Afro-American or Black Baptist minister. So the reason we have to say that he's a Black American Baptist minister is because he's the one who had led this movement, the civil rights movement in America. When you do the civil rights movement in America, there are two different groups actually, who are Christians and who are not Christians, who had a very political agenda and the foundation, and those who had a very religious and a Christian faith-based motives and agenda as he or she commit himself and herself to the movement. So there are two different trends, and it's still the case, and it largely, I mean, there's a large difference where you're coming from, whether you have a political intention or a faith-based religious intention. And Martin Luther King would be one who is committed to the movement, civil rights movement, because of his own faith, because of this kingdom idea, the kingdom where every people, every man and woman are equal under the name of the Messiah and the Christ. And that kingdom to come should be the kingdom we try to exercise on earth. We cannot separate this life and the coming kingdom and just wait for the coming kingdom and sit down and do nothing, but do everything that's possible to bring that coming kingdom to the present, and do your best to make that ideal to be true among our current existence. That's what Martin Luther King Jr. has aimed for. And that's basically evangelical theology. Reinhold Niebuhr, another Niebuhr, is an American Reformed theologian and public intellectual, and advocate the intersection of religion, politics, and public policy. His Moral Man and the Immoral Society is one of the famous books. The Nature and Destiny of Man. These are a couple books that, not even non-Christians are required, have a list in the list of their required reading. So for him, as one who tried to integrate the religion, faith, and life, many many had this dichotic idea to divide our faith and the other dimension of life. Your work is work, your faith is faith. And what you do outside the church is irrelevant to your faith. Many fundamental Christians, because of that reason, they do not try to engage with the secular world or secular stuff. Going out for the movies, that was considered very serious sin. And dancing, going out to the dancing. Of course, at the time, the dancing floor was not so piety, so holy. So, you didn't want to go there. But, the dancing itself is not a sin. And some fundamentalists, some Christians consider it to be sin. Smoking, drinking, all this. So, the idea of trying to integrate political, culture, and public policy and social matters in the community, just injustice, this is kind of new. And this is a new phase of evangelicalism. So evangelicalism is not limiting itself to the so-called religious dominion or the topics, but is trying to extend the power of gospel, the kingdom, beyond the church or beyond your religious life. So that's what this Reinhold Niebuhr tried to do, and he had a great influence in the new thinking of evangelicals. William Cameron Townsend is an American Christian missionary and linguist who founded Wycliffe Bible Translators. The significance or importance of this figure is the Americanism and Christian missionary, American Christian missionary, they had this idea of Americanism. The American culture equals to Christian culture. Some of these missionaries try to seed American culture among these different ethnic groups. As they go out and preach the gospel, they also try to preach the culture, which is now we know that it is not biblical, but at the time they believed the culture they knew as a Christian was American culture, and that American culture was basically equated with very holy and patriotic and moral culture. So it was natural for them to bring that good culture to the people who are less than your culture, lower than your culture. So when William Cameron Townsend began to give emphasis on each ethnic groups with the particular language groups to have their own Bible, that was a very revolutionary idea. Many missionaries tried to teach them English and give them English Bible. And now he begins the work of translating Bible into tribal languages. And so he started this institution mainly focusing. Their only task and the specialty is to translate the Bible into all different tribal language. So to do so, the study of linguistics, which is a very secular kind of academic field, you need to bring that into your study or into Christianity, into the church. And it takes a good study and research to do so. And so it's a very significant event in modern church history, starting to translate Bible into one's own language. C.S. Lewis, another very intellectual figure, very key important figure in Western evangelical faith and a modern church history. He's a British writer and a lay theologian. It's not like an ordained seminarian. Taught at Oxford and Cambridge. The script letters, the Chronicles of Narnia, which he even made as a major movie, and the space trilogy and more writings. So he's a very intellectual writer and an influential figure in the developing of Christian faith. So I strongly recommend to you to read one of these books. The Chronicle of Narnia is a narrative, it's a novel. But Screwtape Letters is one of the key writings that make you think about your own faith. John White also is an evangelical Christian author and an international speaker. And he worked with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students of Latin America. I'll try to explain more of a Fellowship of Evangelical Students later on. So we see this John White and John Stott and some of major figures who are closely related to this International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, which is also closely related and worked with Lausanne Committee. So Lausanne Movement and Evangelicals and International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, also known as InterVarsity Christian Fellowship on the campuses. These are one of the key elements in understanding modern church history. Okay, let's take a short break and I'll come back. Okay, so let's continue. John Piper. Okay, this is also a pastor, theologian, and he's a chancellor of Bethlehem College and Seminary in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He has written several books, key books. desiring God's spectacular scenes, what Jesus demanded from the world. He's one of those practical, how would I say, the pastor who wrote about actual practical practice of Christianity. Bill Bright is an American evangelist, and is also famous for founding Campus Crusade for Christ, also known as CCC, as a ministry for university students. And one of the famous book many of these CCC members use still today is a Full Spiritual Law. It's a little booklet, and you just take it anywhere, and you can just begin conversation with that little booklet. So that's very handy, and it explains what the gospel is. I mean, very simple and content in the gospel. So every Campus Crusade members are trained with this full gospel law, and always keep them handy. The thing is, here's one of the guys, I mean, CCC and Navigators and University. These are some of the major leading movements, should I say, movements that happened in the college campuses. And this is not something new. I mean, it has a root going back to early 19th century. And the student power, the Christian students, when we say students, usually it's college level and up. So those who has beyond high school education, postgraduate school kind of education, they are the ones who lead, or who had led and who is still leading this evangelical movements of today, 20th century and 21st century. I can clearly and surely say they are the ones who lead, and it's not right to say they are the ones who solely contributed to the evangelical movement, but they are the ones who lead and initiated and developed, organized this movement. And these so-called evangelical student movements on the campuses, bringing college students into Christ and training them and nurturing them to become committed, strong, solid Christians, equipped, and sending them into the society, the community, and beyond your own ethnic groups, and go to overseas as missionaries. That's what had led to today's Christian development in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in America itself, and England, and so on. So Bill Bright is one of those who has contributed in mid 20th century to bring the students to Christ and sending them out as the missionaries. One of the contribution of CCC is so-called Jesus films, Jesus movie, which I think is translated into very many different languages, almost 60, many different languages, and it is shown, and it even has a version in Arabic, and so Muslims, they can watch this movie as well. Dawson Trotman is an evangelist, and he's a founder of Navigators. The Navigators also is a campus student movements. And one of the things that you notice, he died trying to save another life. So he has given his life to save others. But the Navigators is also an international global student movement. It's almost in every country that is Christian and not prohibiting Christians. Then Billy Graham, famous Billy Graham, an American evangelist, a prominent evangelical Christian figure and an ordained Southern Baptist minister. Among the most influential Christian leaders of the 20th century. As an evangelist, I personally myself have listened to his crusade for a couple times in Seoul, Korea. Had one famous one in 1974 and another one in 1980. So, everyone, even non-believers, know Billy Graham. And he had a great influence and a relationship with the president. That much, influential. So, he's too famous to explain any further. Harold Okenga. He was a leading figure of mid-20th century American evangelicalism, part of reform movement known as neo-evangelicalism. So there is an evangelicalism, and neo means new evangelicalism. Even though he named it neo-evangelicalism, today we have something called the new evangelicals or open evangelicals. Within the evangelical conservative circle, there's some closed evangelicals and open evangelicals. That doesn't mean that you are open to the inerrancy of Bible. That's not the case. You're open to the culture, the trend, and the history, and the new changes, and new interpretation of Bible, and so on. So you take cultures and the changes and try to adopt yourself as much as possible, not trying to maintain the biblical ethos and teachings and core elements. So while the closed evangelicals are the ones who still keep everything the same, trying to keep everything the same, the practice, the rituals, and the cultures, traditions as well. So these are closed evangelicals. And he is one of the related to Fuller Theological Seminary, which I was a part of. I have studied in the Fuller Theological Seminary for many years, and I've been influenced pretty much greatly by their teachings. And basically, Fuller Theological Seminary is an open evangelical. And also he taught in the Golden Cornell Theological Seminary. Martin Lloyd-Jones is again Welsh Protestant minister and medical doctor. Influential in the Calvinist wing of British evangelical movement in 20th century. And pastor of Westminster Chapel in London. When you are a pastor in the Westminster Chapel in London, it means that you not only have a local influence, but you would have global influence as an evangelical. So you may have listened to some of these sermons, Martin Lloyd-Jones sermons. He is famous for his sermons and preachings as well. Donald McGovern is one of the major missiologists, and he was the dean of a school of world mission in Fuller Theological Seminary. And when I was studying in Fuller Theological Seminary, he was the dean of that school, and he was identified difference of caste and the economic social position as major barrier to the spread of Christianity. And he also is the initiator and propaganda of church growth movement. As the Fuller Theological Seminary had, with the Trinity and the Golden Cornell and Liberty, these are some of the names, including those other major 5 major Southern Baptist seminaries. Some of these major seminaries had a big influence in the development of evangelical Christianity today, because by nature they are the ones who are just teaching and training the new leaders in evangelical circle. So what these professors teach in those institutions will again in turn will make a big impact among the evangelical circles. So thus, this church growth movement, for example, it becomes a major trend in evangelical circles today, globally as well. So he had an international influence. And John Stott, one of the major figures in evangelical and evangelicalism today. He had died in 2011 at the age of 90. But his influence still continues because he has written many great books focusing on the very key contents of biblical teachings, especially the biblical worldview. As an Anglican, English Anglican, he's the one who was able to counsel the Queen Elizabeth, and so that he had that much of influence to what happens in the world as well. And his major contribution, other than his writings, is the Lordland movement. Lordland movement in the 20th century and today, until today, is one of the key leading force or the initiator in modern Christianity and modern church. So without understanding the Lausanne movement and Lausanne Covenant, you are not understanding modern church history. Rune Padilla, he's an Ecuadorian evangelical theologian. One of the few Latin American evangelical figures who has a global influence. And he's a missiologist known for coining the term integral mission. In Spanish, it's Misión Integral in 1970s. And he articulates the Christianity's dual priority in evangelism and social activism. Because, for example, Ecuador, and most of Central and South American countries are in poverty, national poverty. So as a nation, they do not have sufficient economy. And because of that poverty and the social injustice, because of that colonial influence still existing deeply in the society and culture and even the politics, they were concerned with the social justice and social issues much greater than those in America or the so-called first world. So these third world countries, the theologians, by nature, by their own context, has to see what does the gospel has to say about the things that are happening among the people who are suffering unnecessary, needlessly. So Rune Padilla, he tried to answer the question different from those who are insisting on liberation theology. His answer was not about political liberation. He tried to find that answer within the gospel from the kingdom perspective. So thus he came up with this integral mission. So most Western missionaries try to save the soul, meaning share the gospel, convert them into Christianity, and build a church and grow a church. That's how the basic paradigm for the Western missionaries. But those who has grown in within that within the culture, that does not give the answer. Being saved for the eternal kingdom, the coming kingdom, you go to heaven even though you are poor at this life, you will be rich in next life. That would not give the answer to his question. So he contributed himself and committed himself trying to balance these two issues, the gospel, evangelism, and then social need or social responsibility. Thus he comes to, again, Lausanne Conference on Covenant. Samuel Escobar is another Latin American theologian, and is native of Peru and a leading Latin American theologian, and one of the key participants in Lausanne Committee and Lausanne Movement. And he has written also several books that even translated into other languages. And there are not that many prominent, well-known South American theologians or Christian leaders, but these are one of those major figures. So the evangelicalism, it characterized by that it's personal gospel, individualistic and interpersonal God. See that one of the key elements in evangelical faith is interpersonal God. God who is very personal, who touches, who tries to communicate with you individually and personally. And in today's business term, is customized faith or customized religion or customized God. God accommodates himself to every single individual. That's because he is God. He is able to. He is able to. And he is not only able to, he is willing to appropriate and appreciate your needs, your personal matters. So he deals with every and each individual differently and very personally. That's what the evangelical message is about. So different from those Catholic tradition or Lutheran tradition, one or Presbyterian tradition that I know of, it teaches, try to teach very interpersonal, intimate God. So personal salvation, born again gospel, and relevancy are there is some characteristics of evangelical faith. Now the kingdom gospel. All these leaders that we just have seen, especially those ones who are in a modern era, John Stott, for example, and John White, for example, they're trying to see the gospel and the Christianity from the kingdom perspective rather than church perspective. They are not ignoring the ecclesiastic approach to the Christian history. It is included and it is still valid, but like Dr. Latourette, the Christian historian, he sees this movement as a kingdom movement, even though he writes it as a church history. It's rather of a kingdom history, divine kingdom history. So our church history that we are studying is actually the kingdom history. That's my perspective. That's how we should see. And one of those are the Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth and George Ladd. These are some of the major figures that are talking about kingdom gospel. Even though this Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth are the ones who actually began, I mean, they did not intend it, but some of the interpretation leads to the liberal theology. But what they initially tried to do is to build a kingdom perspective, much larger gospel, the Christianity, than what they, traditionally pursued. And I recommend to read some of the George Ladd's writings if you are interested in this kingdom theology or kingdom gospel. Kingdom gospel also is related closely to the holistic gospel. Holistic gospel is the gospel of the evangelical faith. Briefly, the background is this. many Christians try to see the world in two different domains. One secular and one sacred. Sacred is God ordained and it's safe zone. And you go out of this safe zone and you're vulnerable to sin. So because this other word is sinful, you try your best not to relate to this sinful world. And your life is a church life. Church is everything that you know of. And you only associate with the Christians. And you try not to go to places and activities that non-Christians are involved. And this dichotic worldview, division, is very popular among the many Christians. It's been since the Hellenistic, Christianity, and also Judaic Christianity also had its worldview of two separate worlds that you do not associate with the other one. Well, that might be the one way to keep yourself clean, but it's not what God had intended. Holistic gospel is trying to relate yourself to the reality that is given. The reality out there, the world is harsh, is sinful, it's against God. Yes, of course it is. That's why we exist. Not trying to exist wholly within ourselves, but trying to give that influence, good influence, holiness to the sinful world, even though they may not believe God. As a result of it, still you try your best to extend the kingdom of God, the influence of the kingdom, the reign of God to those as well. So the holistic gospel, it includes your life, your work, your business, your school, your marriage life, your home, your education, the culture, the media. These things are all within the dominion. You try to see the whole world, not just your church or your personal devotion. Your personal devotion is important. But if you limit your life, Christian life, to your personal devotion and try to live like a monastery in those dark ages, and you're separating yourself, your gospel is only half gospel. So that's holistic gospel. The evangelical America had experienced two great awakenings. That's how this evangelical America is born. And that's how the evangelical America had influenced the global evangelicalism. So we have discussed, first great awakening and second great awakening. Also, Jonathan Edwards, Charles Finney, Spurgeon. Let's look at these characters to understand evangelical America. Because to try to understand the modern church history, you have to understand American church history, that which we have taught and learned in last quarter. Charles Finney, I will just go over briefly. So, American Presbyterian minister and leader in Second Great Awakening. He has been called the father of old revivalism. And he teaches People have free will to choose salvation. That's one of the key teachings of Charles Finney. It talks about your responsibility as a human being. While the hyper-Calvinism say you can do nothing, you're just nobody, nothing, you're dead, and it's the Holy Spirit who's working, dominantly working, and one-sided working to save you. And Charles Finney says no, that's not the case. We still have our right, the responsibility and right to make that decision, to receive Jesus Christ, and that's your responsibility. And you have free will, still have that free will. You're not dead, but you still have that free will to exercise. That's a part of grace, he said. There's the difference. And I personally believe in Finney's argument rather than hyper-Calvinistic argument. Charles Spurgeon, one of the famous preacher, Baptist preacher, English preacher, he's still highly influential among Christians of various denominations, known as the Prince of Preachers. See, that's his nickname. Opposed the liberal and pragmatic theological tendency of church at his days. So he's the one who strongly went against this liberal theology, Charles Spurgeon. And then we discussed D.L. Moody, Billy Graham, and Charles. Okay, so Charles Stanley. He's a founder of President in Touch Ministry, which widely broadcast his sermon through the television. See, the use of technology is a very new trend in 20th century and 21st century church, modern church. Especially in the time of pandemic that we are experiencing for the last couple of years, technology becomes a major tool for us Christians to not only maintain our faith, but to continue to work, do the evangelism and extend the kingdom and do the missionary works. So technology media is going to become a major discussion, the topic of discussion in this era. And especially for those of you young people, you need to think of how to utilize this very quickly developing technology for the advantage of the kingdom. Okay, there are some of the big names in contemporary American preachers. Not only they just American preachers, because due to the media and technology we just talked about, they become global. Those who are in English-speaking world, they do listen and they do, go for these preachers. Rick Warren, just nearby, only few miles away from here. He's famous in Lake Forest Saddleback Church, and he's very charismatic and fun to listen, and he's also friendly and very informal. He wears shorts on Sundays as he preaches, and the Hawaiian shirts. John MacArthur is one of those fundamental Christians in north of this area, north in the valley area. Is also like John Piper, doesn't beat around bush, is very direct and to the point, and very rigid. Francis Chan, one of the Asian guy, pastor of a church in Simi Valley, one of the new rising preachers. Chuck Swindoll, you probably heard some of his sermons. And James MacDonald as well, and Tim Keller. One of the the pastor I like you to listen to, and his when you say modern evangelical, since John Stott is gone, probably Tim Keller is one of the well-balanced figure that most fully represent our evangelical faith of 21st century. He's a senior pastor in the Redeemer Church in downtown New York. And you listen to him, he's one of probably well-balanced evangelical preacher of the time today. Okay. Yeah, I think our time's up. We have quite a few more topics that we probably want to discuss, but you can do your own study. I gave you the topics and how do the research and use those the material in the textbook, the guidebook as their references. So I hope you to continue your study in modern church history, because if you're a Christian, it is important to know that and study that. And I want you to do that, to continue to study. Thank you for all your effort and for this quarter. And happy Thanksgiving. I'm recording a little early, so this will be after the Thanksgiving, but happy Thanksgiving to you, and Merry Christmas as well. Bye-bye.